Welcome to the first instalment of our Let's Talk Climate series. In this episode, Professors Kevin Anderson and Matt Paterson will talk all things carbon offsetting and discuss whether it's helping or hindering climate action.
Hello, welcome. My name is Jo D'Angelo. I work in Energy Research Communications here at the University of Manchester, and this is Let's Talk Climate with Professors Kevin Anderson and Matt Paterson. Today we're talking about offsetting and specifically, how is it helping or hindering climate action? Now, the beauty of Let's Talk Climate is that it's a conversation with Kevin and Matt, two of our leading experts here at Manchester. Kevin is Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the Universities of Manchester, Uppsala and Bergen, a chartered engineer who moved from industry to academia and now engages governments on issues ranging from aviation and shipping to carbon budgets and negative emissions technologies. And Matt is a Professor of International Politics and the Director of Manchester's Sustainable Consumption Institute, whose research focuses on political economy, global governance, and the cultural politics of climate change, and asks, in what ways is climate change political? Today is a real chance to tap into their unique combination of experience and expertise, and we want it to be a conversation. So please, if you're listening live, send us your questions to @officialUOM with the hashtag UOMClimate, and we'll get through as many as we can. But maybe to start us off, Kevin, we decided on today's topic because you said you're being inundated with questions on offsetting. So could we start at the beginning? What is it? Why is it gaining traction? And what's the problem with it?
Okay. So what is it? Well, offsetting is a form of compensation, and it's been around for a couple of decades or so. And it's primarily where we've got commitments. Now, we say we, that could be an individual, it could be an institution or a company or indeed a country. So we have our commitments on climate change to reduce our emissions. And these, some of us think are too challenging for us to deliver on. So for a company or a country, we think, well, we can't make that level of cuts, or sometimes we might just think we'd rather not make that level of cuts. And so the way that we can still meet our targets, at least is the claim of the offsetters, is then to pay someone else to make the reductions on our behalf. So that's the principle of offsetting, is to make the total level of reductions that are necessary, but some people can pay others to make the reductions for them, or at least some of the reductions for them. And I think the reason it's become much more attractive is, well, it's been around for a long time, for a couple of decades, over that now, almost 3 decades. But as we've increasingly failed to deliver on making any real meaningful cuts in emissions, and indeed global emissions keep on rising, then actually the targets, the commitments that we make get increasingly more challenging. And this is where the real, more recent appeal of offsetting comes in. As the challenges get more and more difficult, so it becomes more and more attractive to find another way out of that difficult problem. And offsetting says we can find that by paying someone else to make those reductions for us. Remember, those reductions have to be in addition to the reductions those other people have to make anyway. Now, I think Matt and I will get into the problems in this discussion, but I think I'll start off with my sort of headline conclusion is that certainly some of the projects funded by offsetting are definitely worthwhile, and we should continue to fund them. But in specific terms of delivering reductions in line with our Paris commitment to hold the temperature rise to no more than 1.5, and at the worst 2 degrees centigrade, then I see offsetting as actually worse than doing nothing. It removes the incentive for us high emitters to make deep and rapid changes to the way that we're emitting, and often to the way that we live our lives. The funding that is needed in other parts of the world for helping them with development, often at a system level, we'll see a rise in emissions. Even if we fund renewables elsewhere, at a system level, they're likely to see an increase in development and a rise in emissions, and that should be welcomed, but it's not an offset. The 30 years of failure that we've had on climate change mean that now, in 2023, the emission space we have left is so incredibly tight for everyone that there is literally no flexibility for anyone to say, I will take up the responsibility for someone else. And that's a really key issue. For the Paris 1.5 degrees commitment, at current level of emissions, we've got about 9 years of global emissions before we blow through 1.5. And even for 2 degrees centigrade, with much, much more climate impacts, then we only have about 19 years. So in 2023, I just don't think offsetting has any role to play, and it actually is part of the problem. But some of the projects that are funded by offsetting are definitely worthwhile, and we need to find another mechanism for funding them, but not call it an offset.
Do you want to come in on that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I broadly agree that offsetting is highly problematic. It has been for most of its areas. I think one of the things I'll sort of build on what Kevin said or respond to is to go back to this history, right? So they've got actually first carbon offset project claimed was actually in 1989. And it was completely, even before there was actually negotiations to what became the climate treaty. And then there was a handful of them during the 1990s. But it became integral to the design of the Kyoto Protocol. There was a thing in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 called the Clean Development Mechanism. It was essentially a massive carbon offsetting scheme within the UN process. And then, of course, then there was two things there that are quite different to what are now. One is that the level of ambition was incredibly low, right? Industrialized countries had agreed to reduce their emissions by 5.2% by 2012, right? Really low ambition. The second was that only rich countries had obligations under that treaty to reduce their emissions. So the point that Kevin was saying is that the logic of offsetting then was rich countries paying poor countries to reduce their emissions on their behalf. Right? And so and the other thing that was really prevalent at that point of view, everybody was really enthralled to really mainstream orthodox economists who were obsessed about market efficiency. So the logic then was, from an economic point of view, was saying the climate doesn't care where the emissions are reduced from, it just cares that the emissions go down. Why don't we try and see how we can do that the cheapest possible way? The emissions cuts are often cheaper in developing countries because labour costs are cheaper. Let's do it that way. That will reduce the overall costs of reducing those emissions and mean that we can be more ambitious. Now, it didn't actually in practice mean that we were more ambitious. That's part of the basic problem of that logic. But that was the storyline for why offsetting made sense at that point in time. You wanted to do it where it was cheapest. The ambition was fairly low, so nobody, you weren't in the situation that Kevin was talking about there. I mean, we were logically, but nobody thought of it that way. That we needed to absolutely get our emissions, as near to zero as possible. So fast forward, so that actually dominates the Kyoto period through from 1997 through to about 2012 and a little bit after. Then you see, actually, because they don't agree a second period under Kyoto, and that bit of the UN process collapses basically in the early 2010s, and we get what becomes the Paris Agreement instead. And the two things that are different there, or that become different during the course of the last decade, is all countries have emissions reductions under the Paris Agreement. Everybody has to commit a nationally determined contribution sort of commitment. They're differential by rich countries and poor countries still, but in a much more ad hoc way and not in that systematic division between the two block groups of countries. And secondly, over time, the level of ambition gets much more ambitious. Now, the level of ambition in terms of the rhetoric of the target versus the actual achievement is there's a big gap there in more or less everywhere. But nevertheless, increasingly during the 2010s, people start saying they're going to try and get their emissions to zero. The word is net zero. We'll come back to the net bit in a minute. By 2050-ish, right? So then what you've got is if everybody's trying to get their emissions to zero, then Kevin's point becomes really salient, right? Or one of the points Kevin made, right? Where are you going to offset to, right? So if the rich countries' emissions said in the old model had said, oh, we're going to pay for emissions reductions elsewhere, the elsewhere no longer exists because everybody is trying to get to zero, at least rhetorically, right? And so the logic of emissions reductions there the logic of carbon offsetting there starts to make less and less sense. But this is also where the nets come in, and I think it's where, if you look at the places now that are trying to, the institutions, just think about the UK, the offsetting is no longer happening, or at least no longer only happening in the global south. There are offsetting projects going on in Britain now to offset emissions by companies in Britain now. And they've been stimulated by the net zero rhetoric by government by saying, okay, well, it's all right then. The net suddenly become it started off feeling quite a radical proposition, the net zero, because the word zero is quite a big number or an important number. But actually, the net, like think, companies in universities have started doing it. Lots of institutions have said, okay, well, we can get to net zero. But the point is that the planet doesn't care whether Shell or a university or HSBC or Tesco's is net zero. It's only at the level of the world that it matters. Right, so it's had this false logic of really encouraging people down the offsetting line in a way that doesn't really make sense. And the only way it can plausibly make sense now, it used to make sense as a market efficiency logic. Now the way it makes sense at one level, I would agree. Kevin and I would probably agree that it doesn't really make sense, but this is how it's argued for, is that it makes sense to actually focus on the things that the negative emissions, the things that will take carbon out of the atmosphere. Because again, everybody should be getting to near zero as they possibly can by 2050-ish or earlier. But there will be some things that are almost irreducible, right? The point that Kevin made about solar panels in developing countries, that will actually cause emissions elsewhere in those economies to rise. And the system effects there. And there may be some forms of emissions, aspects of emissions, we can debate what those would be, that are almost irreducible and that might need other mechanisms to take carbon out of the atmosphere, So that's how people can sort of semi-plausibly argue for offsets to be part of that. But then the question is again, back to Kevin's one, is a carbon offset mechanism the best way to actually fund that afforestation, peatland restoration, mangrove restoration, blue ocean-based carbon sequestration, all the places, and then the more science fiction versions of direct air capture and so on. So I think that's the sort of first reaction, that it's worth paying attention to how those arguments for offsets have changed over time, and they've in some ways become more problematic, in some ways become quite different, right? It's no longer necessarily a big global north-south project dynamic, which always had sort of semi-colonial characteristics to it, and those sorts of problems that are less so, but other sort of problems have come in their place.
Just want to come back on a couple of things there. This time frame issue, which is absolutely key. So it's very easy to fall in this language of net zero by 2050. But in every single agreement, going back to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a terrible name, but anyway, that was the big international agreement in Rio in 1992 that was ratified in 1994. Ever since then, right the way through to the last year's agreement in Egypt, there's been this concept of equity embedded in what's called, another terrible acronym, common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. In other words, poor countries have a little bit longer to move away from fossil fuels and to reduce their emissions to very, very low levels. And so when you take that into account, and that is virtually ignored by every single rich country in the world, including the UK, then if you want to stay within our carbon budgets and you just can do a little bit of arithmetic with that bit of fairness, and it's still not very fair, then it means that wealthy countries like the UK need to be zero emissions by about 2030, and for 1.5 and about 2035 for 2 degrees centigrade. The poorer countries have a bit longer, maybe a decade to a decade and a half at most, with some of the ones like China being sooner and places like Rwanda taking a little bit longer. So the time frame issue, this net zero 2050, is deeply misleading. So the 2050 part is misleading, and so as Matt points out, so is the net part. This part about effectively we're allowing ourselves, or allowing our children to, hoping our children will remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere with technologies that are either in a few models in universities or in some very, very small pilot schemes around the world at the moment. They're not out there at scale, at anything like scale. And these will remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the other thing that Matt noted was about things like what we call afforestation, what we call nature-based solutions. So using nature, planting trees is the obvious one, to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, people who have looked at this, who are experts in this area, say that you cannot compensate for the fossil fuel emissions. So taking fossil fuels from the lithosphere, taking oil and gas from deep in the earth, burning it and pumping the CO2 in the atmosphere, that's a permanent shift from the lithosphere into the atmosphere, or it's a virtually permanent shift transfer. You can't then compensate that by some temporary carbon cycle transfer by using nature. It simply isn't the same thing to say plant a few trees and that allows us to burn more kerosene in our planes. These are not the same thing. There are a whole set of scientific reasons and risks to do with uncertainty that mean these cannot be seen as compensation. And people like Johan Roxton has made this point repeatedly. So let's be clear here. No tree planting, no nature-based solutions can be used to offset for energy-based emissions. Now, maybe you can use some of those ones to help compensate for other form of land use-based emissions, but not for energy-based emissions. And that takes away a huge part of the offsetting, of the negative emissions rather, and indeed of the offsetting, which is these things are used, again, as I say, to help the high emitters to continue their current high emission lifestyles. But when you start to unpick it with the science and with the maths, these things just fall by the wayside. And we found in the end that we actually have to make the real reductions ourselves.
So, Kevin, I suppose I feel like I've been slightly duped. So when you buy an airplane ticket, for example, you have the opportunity to offset. Is that an effective form of an organisation greenwashing a consumer? Is there a place, you talked about there are projects worth investing. Is there a place for offsetting, or is it literally a form of greenwashing?
Right, let's be clear about the language. If we are using the language of offsetting, absolutely not. There is no, in my view, it's just categorical. If we're to deliver on our Paris commitments, and they are so hugely challenging, then there is absolutely no place for offsetting. But there absolutely is a place for the projects that some of the offsetting money that we have today is currently being used to fund. So my take on that is that if aviation is a good example, we should be trying to cut back as much as possible as we can on aviation, bearing in mind, of course, that very few people actually fly. And those that do fly, the ones that drive aviation are generally those who fly very regularly. So we should cut back in how much we can fly. And if we feel that the flight is really important, then we have to accept that is a set of emissions we are putting into the atmosphere. Other people have got to put up with the impacts that's occurring. So let's just accept those emissions. But let's try not to fly whenever we can possibly avoid it. But then what we could do is to say, right, what I will do, I will fund a really worthwhile project somewhere. Now, that project could be anything. It could be on female literacy in some part of the world. It could be on helping youths just down the street in the city you live. Just fund a good project with some significant amount of your funds. Now, what you've done then, you've funded a good project that has nothing to do with climate change, nothing to do with offsetting anyway, and you've had the emissions from the flight. One thing's a bad thing, one thing's a good thing. So at least then what you've done is one bad thing and one good thing. If you just fly and offset, as far as I'm concerned, you're just really doing a bad thing. And so separate the two. Cut back on the flying as much as possible. If you think it's any or whatever sort of emissions, if you think those emissions are unavoidable, or you're not prepared to make any reductions any further, then pay to do a good project elsewhere. But that does not compensate for the emissions or for the warming or for the impacts we've imposed on other people in the world. So separate the two. Do some good with our money and try to cut back on our emissions. And if we're not prepared to make those final cuts, then pay and do something worthwhile elsewhere. No offset.
Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the aviation one's a really interesting one because it's where it has been the place where individuals have been brought into, like individuals, us, and especially, as Kevin pointed out, relatively small numbers of people in global terms who fly anything more than once every few years. That get drawn into the offsetting world and drawn into thinking about climate change, and it's a sort of good way of understanding how we're drawn in via our guilt, rather than via some sense of wanting to do something positive. And so again, back in the sort of 2000s, when offsetting really took off first, in around 2005, 4-5 onwards, it became a big and that was driven. It's certainly in the public domain. The sense of public domain was it was driven by when people were booking a flight. Suddenly, you booked a flight, and they said, "Do you want to offset your emissions?" Right? And some of the carbon offsetting organisations, either people who actually say they take the money off the airline companies that are collecting this money from us, from people who fly, and then putting it into some project. Right? Those carbon offsetting companies, or NGOs often as well, were then marketing that, would develop marketing ties with the airlines, right? So that would become an automatic part of the booking process. But in terms of what Kevin was talking, if you think about it, then, I was living in Canada at the time, living and working in Canada at the time, periodically coming back to Europe for work or to visit family. And so I was watching that starting, and I was working on carbon markets at the same time, at that sort of time academically. To fly from Canada to Frankfurt, say, they would be charging you something like €5-6 to offset your flight. And so it became like, it was almost like a perverse thing, right? I would have believed it more if they'd charged me €40 or €50. It was incredibly cheap to do it, right? And so it felt like, it actually reinforced the sense of it being a scam, and reinforced the guilt about flying and all the dilemmas that Kevin once, was highlighting. Well, not dilemmas, but the sort of demand of separating out those two things about wanting to improve, do something good, and feeling slightly culpable because of the bad that we are definitely still causing by flying. But the sort of the economic and the impulse and the motivations and the way that market was built was building on these fears and anxieties that we've had, right? And actually the fact that it was really, really cheap to do so, probably still is. I don't know. I haven't looked for ages. I haven't, just decided it was enough of a scam. I'm not going to bother it on those relatively rare occasions I still fly. But Kevin is famous for not having flown for 30 odd years. But so I think it's that sort of, that's the mobilization, and shows that the mobilization is much about trying to make people feel guilty and helping people manage and assuage that sense of guilt, as it is actually about doing anything serious about climate. And the other bit, quantitatively, those individual offset credits that were being purchased have always been very small. Like, the vast majority of the buyers are big corporate buyers. So the logic for them is actually rather different. It's about PR and green PR and making claims and having splashy bits of their their sustainability annual reports. But the sort of logic for individuals is quite different, and how they've been sold to us, and how they're still being sold to us.
So,
and aviation has been the core site for that. You can offset other bits. You can go onto a carbon calculator and say, this is my energy, but this is my electricity bill, this is my gas bill, blah blah blah, each year, and they will work out a number for you to offset your whole household emissions if you like. But aviation is where it's been at, partly because it's so visible and it's so a thing that we recognise. I remember, for example, my mother once doing a carbon calculator. This was about 2009. And calculating all her emissions, and she was like, "Oh, I did well. I'm buying from a renewable energy company. I don't drive that much. Blah 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 blah." And then she put her aviation in. Oh, now it was like easily 80% of her emissions were aviation. So that's why that became a key part of the market.
Kevin, do you want to come in?
Well, just quickly on this, there is this discussion about aviation at an individual level, but if you look at for instance, in the UK is a very good example, because we've got the Committee on Climate Change. They provide very helpful spreadsheets that sort of underpin the scenarios, the net zero future scenarios that we have for the UK. Very few other countries provide this. So significant credit goes to the Committee on Climate Change for putting their numbers out there. But you look at 2050 and say, where are the emissions in the UK still coming from in 2050? And they've got about 21 or 22 million tonnes of carbon dioxide for a small country like the UK still coming from aviation in 2050. And remember, it's not going to stop in 2050. They don't extend beyond that period in their spreadsheets. You can make a reasonable assumption it's going to go on for a decade or two or three after that. And so even in the analysis that's done by the groups in this, we embed in those scenarios ongoing use of aviation. And aviation is the big issue in terms of offsetting, because the claim is they use the language of difficult to abate sectors. My view on that, well, yes, it's all difficult to abate. I don't care if it's difficult, only if it's impossible. It isn't impossible to abate most of the emissions from aviation, but you have to do it with demand management, because the technology cannot deliver in the time frame that we have. But in the scenarios, for instance, the Committee on Climate Change ones that underpin government's policy, we assume that aviation carries on pretty much as it is today, if not grows significantly. And why is that? because the people producing the scenarios, we are the ones that regularly fly. So it's the one bit we can't imagine doing without, and so forth. So that we therefore embed that in the scenarios. We're not prepared to accept the demand management that would be imposed primarily on those of us who fly frequently. And we'd always turn around and say, we don't want to stop poor people flying to Benidorm once a year. They are not the people driving aviation. They're the people, the rich people who fly frequently, are using as an excuse for carrying on with aviation. If we were serious about aviation, we would drop the demand for it. But because we're not prepared to do that, we require something like offsetting or negative emission technologies at some point, decades from now, to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. We're simply unprepared to accept that the high emitters amongst us would need to make some pretty fundamental changes to how we travel around the globe, or whether we travel around the globe. And we're unprepared to do that. And we call that difficult to abate. What we really mean is, wealthy ones amongst us aren't prepared to make that level of cuts to our lifestyles.
Okay, so on that point, and I'm going to start bringing in some questions from our audience now, but just before I do, it feels like an unregulated market, or it feels like a land for villains, or whatever we want to call them. But what policies need to be put in place? What would you be recommending?
I think this is Matt's terrain really more than mine here. What would you be recommending?
Matt, can I bring you in there?
Most of the offsetting, when offsets came along, I mentioned some really early project in 1989. Basically was and through the 1990s into about 2005-ish period. Basically, anybody doing an offset project could make it up. They could just say, we are doing this project, we're planting this many trees, or we're building this many wind turbines, or whatever it was, and this will cut emissions by X, and therefore we'll sell this many credits up to the amount of X to the people who want to offset their emissions through this project. Right? And that was, and in around 2000, in the early mid 2000s, there was a whole load of exposés of projects which were clearly scams. And there were some very high profile ones, but the funniest one to my mind is the band Coldplay decided they were going to try and offset the emissions from their world tour that year through a series of forestry projects in southern India, if I remember rightly. And they went horribly wrong, and Coldplay, being the sort of band they are, got very embarrassed. All right. So there was a whole series of things there. And at the same time, what then happened was that a lot of the NGOs, relatively mainstream NGOs, the most important of these is World Wide Fund for Nature, decided that there was actually a sort of gap in the offsetting system that was emerging, which was to basically, and the way that they would fill that was by certifying projects as good or not. Right. And so quite quickly, between about 2005 and 2008 or so, you get a whole ecology as about 40 of these things emerge. And they basically develop a system of systems to mimic what had been done in the clean development mechanism in the broader offset market outside that regulated market in the CDM, to basically verify and then certify the claims that were being made by the project developers, right? We're going to plant X hectares of trees and it's going to absorb that much carbon, to actually go and measure and validate those claims, right? And that existed already in the clean development mechanism. That was a key part of the architecture for that. And then there were one or two the UK did have a scheme at some point at the national policy level as well for certifying offset projects. And so that sort of still remains, as far as I can make out. It will have developed because basically what we've had is this growth of offsets, and then this lull in the mid-2000s, and then the expansion that we're going through again at the moment with the shift to net zero. And I think they've still got mostly those certification systems in place. They are themselves subject to all sorts of criticisms, right? That the relationships between the people doing the certifying are quite close to the companies. The certifying, like the auditors, the people who go into the project, they first read the project document, like before the project happens, and says, yes, this is a credible set of claims or not. And then they come in and after the project's been developed, and they try and measure to see if the actual project was developed in the way that it was intended. And obviously those relationships are very close, as they are between any organisation and the accountants doing its auditing. And periodically there's some good evidence that there's quite a lot of but that regulatory system is too lax, right? So the claims don't stand up to as much. You can't take them at face value. And there was a big analysis of the clean development mechanism, which has this similar sort of regulatory arrangement that showed that perhaps 10% of the whole projects that were done in the life of the CDM from 2005-ish to 2020-ish really stood up to critical scrutiny in terms of the claims they made about emissions reduction. Even at the project level, leaving aside the sort of system effects that Kevin talked about, that even if you fund a renewable project in the global south, they'll still, but if it contributes to development, then emissions overall might still go up at the system level. But even on its own terms, just the project, those claims didn't really stand up to scrutiny. So it's very difficult to have a really, really strong certification system. Obviously, the NGOs systems led by WWF, they just basically operate on the basis that anybody who wants, if HSBC or some big company like that wants to offset its emissions, it doesn't want to be exposed to scams. That's the rationale for that regulatory system. It doesn't have any authority other than that reputational cost to the company, and therefore we've got the kite mark of WWF, and therefore our project is okay. Right, so that's a relatively weak form of regulatory control. No government, as far as I'm aware, has developed any serious sort of interventions to say, if we're going to allow offsets at all on our territory, these are the rules that you'll have to follow that are anything like credible. So there's a big gap in that, and I think that they support, which supports the general argument, which is that offsets are really, really highly problematic, and at best have to be restricted to really, really small number of areas where you could really measure you at least have to be able to measure the emissions reductions credibly, which is very difficult. And some of the things now is that the projects that are most plausible from an offsetting point of view in terms of the net zero logic that we talked about earlier on are the ones that are the hardest to measure the actual carbon uptake, right? Forestry and land use ones, measuring the carbon uptake from those is particularly difficult. Measuring the emissions reductions from a wind turbine is a bit easier. But there's no point in that from an offsetting point of view, Tom, even under its own terms. Kevin, you were going to say something?
Yeah, it's a more sort of generic comment here that offsetting effectively brings a price mechanism into how we control emissions. So, as I said, I think offsetting it's not deeply problematic. I think it's actually worse than doing nothing. But price mechanisms themselves are also problematic more generally. Because if you have an offsetting scheme whereby, and let's imagine that you could come out with offsetting cost, and it was a legitimate one, not like €5 for a flight to Canada, that it was going to add €500 or €1,000 to the flight. The problem with that is it allows the wealthy to carry on emitting because they can simply afford it. And that, I think, is a really divisive message to send to society, wider society, that if you can afford it, you can carry on with business as usual. But the rest of us, and particularly the majority, even in wealthy countries, will have to make dramatic changes to how it is that they're living their lives. They will not be able to afford the occasional flight to visit one of their family living elsewhere in the world. Meanwhile, Bill Gates, Schwarzenegger, Musk, and all of the others will merrily call themselves zero, even net zero emitters, because they're offsetting their private flights and their trips into space. And they will be able to carry on with business as usual. And no journalist, of course, ever has the guts to actually tackle these people directly. And so I think there's a real issue about the price mechanism. It is deeply unfair for many people around the world, even in wealthy countries, because it allows the wealthy, particularly the very wealthy, to carry on with business as usual, and others simply are priced out of being able to pursue those sort of activities, which is why I would much rather see some sort of regulatory framework or standard that had fairness embedded deeply within it, than a price mechanism that just says the rich can carry on and everyone else has to make the big reductions for them.
Can I start bringing in some questions from our listeners? Kevin, perhaps this one's for you, and it touches on what you're saying about net zero, but what amount of carbon dioxide would need to be offset in order to meet net zero by 2050?
I'm trying to think how to understand that question, really. What would how much would need to be offset? I mean, I know the amount of carbon dioxide we can emit is given to us by the science in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And the numbers for 1.5, we have about 380 billion tonnes. of carbon dioxide we can emit, and for 2 degrees centigrade, about 780 billion tonnes. So I said 9 to 19 years of current emissions. So that's how much we can emit if we into the atmosphere, according to the science, if we want to stay below those levels of warming. So if we wanted to be able to emit more than that, so say you wanted to emit 1,000 billion tonnes, then we'd have to find some way to remove whatever it happens to be. So somewhere between 700 and 250 billion tonnes of CO2 from the atmosphere. We'd have to find some technologies for doing that, and they simply do not exist at the moment. So however much you exceed the carbon budgets by, remember the carbon budgets come out of the science. They're not absolute certain numbers, but they give us a really good handle on how much carbon dioxide we can dump in the atmosphere, which basically means how many fossil fuels can we burn, and we know that pretty well correlation between the two. And anything we exceed those budgets by, we have to find some way of compensating. So for 1.5 degrees centigrade, for say 50-50 chance of that, as I say, we have 9 years of current emissions. Now there's nothing, even if you had a global agreement, it would take 2 or 3 years to start bringing emissions down significantly. And so I would say the 1.5 one is virtually impossible. For 50-50 chance of it. Now, you might get an outside chance. You might be lucky if your emissions are higher. The science is sufficiently uncertain. We might be lucky and we still might get an outside chance of not exceeding 1.5. But whatever we exceed the budgets by is the amount we would have to find to remove out of the atmosphere. But remember, when we exceed the budgets, often there's a time gap between when we exceed those budgets and when we in the future generations we remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now in that time gap, what we have to do is keep our fingers crossed that the global system won't notice that and give us additional feedbacks. And this set of feedbacks, some people call them tipping points. It's a bit of an overly simplistic term, but basically these additional feedbacks can make the situation much worse. So if we exceed the budgets and then hope in the future be able to remove the CO2, we have to hope that the atmosphere and that the global system will not have sets of feedbacks that make the situation much worse. And the science in that is still quite uncertain. Some scientists think we've already hit a lot of these major big feedbacks and we're going to see ongoing rises in temperatures. Other scientists think actually probably we've got a little bit longer before we hit the major feedbacks. Either way, the science is fairly clear. Those feedbacks are there. And from a precautionary approach, it would suggest that we need to keep the emissions as low as possible and not compensate by some sort of sucking the CO2 out in the future, at least not rely on it. Let's research it and let's put them in place if they meet ecological and social sustainability criteria. But let's not rely on them and say we'll expand our airports because we think in the future we'll find some way to suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. We need to make those radical, deep changes to how we're living our lives today. And whether it's in our houses, our cars, our travel habits, our industries, across the board, we need to make rapid, deep changes. We're in this position because broadly our leaders and indeed many of the expert community have either failed or often even have lied to us for the last 30 years on climate change, and emissions have just gone up year after year.
Thanks, Kevin. Matt, I've got one for you now.
Okay.
Does a distinction need to be made between carbon credits and the practice of carbon offsetting?
So, the short answer is no. Essentially, those are two ways of describing the same or a different aspect of the same thing, right? So if you're funding a carbon offset project, a wind turbine somewhere else and so on, you're using that to offset against your own emissions, then the way that would work as a sort of market would be the product that would be generated, if you like, from that transaction is called a carbon credit, right? So in the clean development mechanism, that was called a certified emissions reduction. And various of the other sort of voluntary offset markets, people offsetting their flights, have different names or acronyms to describe that. And typically, almost all of those are then denominated in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's how they're measured or packaged together that you buy, right? So that €5 a ton for that flight, whenever it was 15 years ago, or so would have been generated out of a calculation of the number of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent of that flight, however they calculated that. So that's what the relationship, it's more like what's the relationship between a carbon credit. A carbon credit is essentially the product that you buy if you're offsetting your emissions, and it's the product that a project developer, somebody doing the project, the wind turbine project, generates themselves. into that market. I think there's another bit of in that question. There's a second part of that question that was put up on Twitter, which is prioritising reduction, being transparent about targets and measured emissions, and contributing to good quality certified projects, quotes, without claiming neutrality is surely additional. I think the point there is really Kevin's one from right at the beginning, which is that yes, prioritising reduction, being transparent about your targets and your measured emissions, absolutely, and getting those to zero as fast as you possibly can. The point then is that any other money you would buy, is A, that you invest, if you're going to contribute to good quality certified projects, then if everybody else is also trying to get zero, then where would those projects come from, right? What's the demand for those? Nobody's wanting to offer them because they're trying to get their own emissions to zero anyway, and therefore the logic, the question really is how else might you finance and contribute to helping other parts of the world or other people in the world get their emissions down to zero without, as you say, without claiming. But if you're saying without claiming neutrality, then you're basically saying you're not carbon offsetting. You're just funding somebody else's project. Right? So that's I think is the sort of response to that question.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. We're running close to our time now, so I've got one more question before I'm going to ask you to wrap up. We have been given some more questions about the general politics of climate change in total that I don't think we're going to get round to, but so apologies for that. But the final question from the audience is, Kevin, you said that energy-based emissions cannot be offset, but some land use-based emissions could be acceptable. What are they?
Well, from land use, as far as we can tell, there is no way to eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions. So even if the whole world went vegan and you adopted the world's best agricultural practices, there will be still some methane emissions and some N2O emissions from the use of fertilizer, even if it's organic fertilizer. And those emissions cannot be eliminated. We can reduce them. We can certainly improve agricultural practices. We can change our diets, but we cannot eliminate them. And they all add to the warming. And so we'll have to find some way of compensating for that level of warming. So maybe that's through some other land-based practice, like, for instance, by some. I don't like afforestation. I will get to the details of this. So, improving existing forests, forest restoration, which is areas that have been recently deforested, being reforested, that can be beneficial. Afforestation of turning sort of plains and savannas and so forth into somewhere for trees can have big problems with immobilizing emissions from the soils. So it's a very complicated issue. You just plant something and we assume it absorbs carbon, but in reality, the science shows it's much more complicated than that. Nevertheless, within the land use sector, because we're going to have some emissions from ongoing agriculture to feed 8 to 10 million people, we'll have to find some other way within the land use sector to try to absorb some level of warming, so that some level of emissions, so that the overall warming from land use is zero. But all of that means that's going to be difficult to do. We're still not certain how to do that. But all that means there is absolutely no scope for using land-based, nature-based, often quite temporary and highly uncertain and quite risky forms of sequestration, of absorbing CO2, to compensate for the certainty of emissions that come from burning fossil fuels, from taking what was effectively plants that have been buried for millions of years and turned into oil, gas, and coal, to taking them out of the ground and spewing those into the atmosphere. But there are lots of good reasons why that switch between sort of trees, if you like, nature-based, and locked-in oil, gas, and coal, that those things can't be compensated. But we will need something to help us with the agricultural emissions. But of course, we can get those down as well by significantly changing our eating habits and by better agricultural practices. But there is no offsetting for energy fossil fuel emissions.
Perfect. So I'm going to take us over by 3 minutes, because I just want to end up with each of you giving a final word. So you've been very frank, so I really appreciate that. But is there just one thing you want our listeners to go away with today? What would it be? Maybe Matt, if I could start with you.
Well, I think the general point is that for me is that it's building on the sort of general tenor of the discussion, which is that offsets have a really, really deeply problematic and probably should play no role. Kevin might say that's stronger than me, but I think this is actually to think about why we get pushed into thinking that offsets might be a good thing. right? What are the pressures to actually say, oh, I need to offset my emissions, or we need to offset our emissions from an organisational or a country or an individual point of view? And that's telling us quite a lot about the cultural and the social difficulties of weaning ourselves off a high carbon, fossil fuel driven world, right? And so that's just pointing us in the right direction to say, do the more work to think about what is involved in the changes that we are going to need to make, and the offsets are sort of making us feel like maybe it's okay after all because I can offset my way, which is a false sort of promise.
Kevin, what about you?
Well, I think I'd colour my message let's simplify the world into two groups: wealthy people and not so wealthy people, and that could be considered poorer people. For the wealthy ones amongst us, and we're the ones that, of course, that are driving the emissions most significantly, and they're, of course, we're not just in the wealthy parts of the world, we're in some of the poor parts of the world as well. There's lots, there are wealthy people in China and in some of the African countries as well. So looking at wealthy people in general, we need to rapidly cut our emissions, and that means changing our behaviours. Where we are not prepared to go any further and cut our emissions, we need to try further. But if we're not prepared to, then let's pay some significant money to do some good elsewhere. Now, I don't mind what that project is. Just do something worthwhile with the money. But that does not in any way, shape, or form compensate for our emissions. The other thing I would ask that group to do, our group to do, is to engage politically, to push the policymakers really hard to put in place policies and to drive technologies and to drive social change in our societies in line with the commitments we've made. For the rest of the world, and that's the majority, of course, relatively low emitters anyway, relative to the average. The average is pushed up by the high emitters. And for that group, often there's not a lot they can do to significantly change their emissions. Yes, let's do that. Let's encourage people or everyone to make changes where they reasonably can. But I don't want them to feel responsible because they're really hard to make those changes. So in the UK, you might be in one of the many households that's struggling to pay their bills, but you don't own the house, you rent it, or you cannot. So therefore, you can't afford to improve the insulation, to put solar panels on the roof, all those other things. So for those particular groups, engage politically. Push the policymakers to put in place policies. But do not feel guilty because some oil companies talked about offsetting or an aviation company has talked about offsetting. So this is, there is a big difference in responsibility between the different groups in our society. And this gives us different levers that we need to be pulling. So everyone can engage politically, and some of us can engage by changing our behaviours dramatically. And ultimately, at the end of the day, do not pay for any offset. But if you can afford it, pay for good projects elsewhere. And make that payment difficult. Make it painful to us so it actually makes us think twice again about flying or whatever next time we're going to do it.
Brilliant. That's a really good place to end. Thank you both. It's been brilliant as a conversation, and I really appreciate how candid and honest you've been. And just before we go, I want to thank everyone who's joined us and sent in questions. The recording of this conversation will be available to listen to again on our profile. So please share it with anyone you think might be interested. And thank you again for joining us. I really do feel it's only by having these kind of conversations that are really open and honest, and by having access to people like you, Matt and Kevin, that we can start to have access to the right information that's going to change the way we act and behave. So on that note, thanks again, and we really look forward to speaking to you all again soon.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Follow us on Twitter @officialuom for more live Twitter Space events.